Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi, and welcome to the ISO Show. Well, on the last episode, we had Paul Robinson, Managing Consultant, on the podcast, providing some insights into ISO 50001, the Energy Management Standard. Now, we are actually doing a bit of a blitz over the next few podcast episodes on ISO 50001. And the reason for doing that is it's such an important topic when it comes to the planet. Because for those organisations that are using energy, and let's face it, we all use energy, but some use energy more than others, it's really important that we try and tackle that in terms of being able to optimise use of resources and try and reduce our carbon footprint where possible. Now, the last episode, Paul just provided a bit of an overview really on the importance of having an energy management standard. And he also just explained briefly at a really kind of top level, what clauses were included in the standard. So he mentioned that clauses 1, 2 and 3 were explanatory clauses for information purposes, and then he provided an overview of clauses 4 to 10. So in this episode, Paul's going to be unpacking those clauses and providing you with further detail on what those requirements actually are and interpreting those clauses. So what does context of the organisation mean? So you will notice if you are already certified to an ISO standard, and that could be ISO 9001 for quality or a health and safety standard, that there is quite a bit of similarity here. But Paul will also explain why this is very relevant from an energy management perspective. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Paul Robinson back to the podcast. Hey, Paul.
Hi, Mel. How you doing?
Great, thanks. Yeah, looking forward to you drilling down into a lot more detail about the key clauses within ISO 50001 and how businesses can actually use these to make a difference in their organisations. So why don't we kick off with clause 4, which is context, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, clause 4 is broken down into 4 subclauses, starting with 4.1, understanding the organisation and its context. And what this is trying to do is determine those big high-level issues that are affecting you as an organisation. So things that are pulling and pushing you around as a business. When I'm sat with directors trying to explain this clause, I'm basically asking them, what are the big issues that are keeping you awake at night? Obviously, with an energy management system, we're talking about it in that context. It's energy issues that are affecting your organisations, and they can be quite broad in their nature. It could be national policy, it could be energy supply concerns, energy security. We've had lots of issues in regards to the cost of energy, just lately, and that's going to be causing a lot of organisations major concerns. I mean, we see that in very energy intensive industries with things like glass bottling plants. The production of carbon dioxide was badly affected by the cost of energy recently as well, and those plants had to actually close for periods of time and actually had to have government intervention to help them survive due to just purely the cost of energy. But there's other factors as well, things like the effects of weather and the long-term effects of climate change that we touched on in the previous podcast. And also big focus on greenhouse gas emissions as well, and obviously driving climate change and a big push to drive those down. Again, the use and consumption of energy is very often driving that. So these will all be sort of big examples of the sort of issues that organisations will be wrestling with probably at the moment, as we speak. At a more sort of operational level, we could be talking about business objectives, strategy, asset management, long-term considerations in regards to equipment, maintenance, financial resource, again available to support that, maturity of the existing technologies. You might be looking to shift to new technologies, and other sort of operational risks as well that could be pushing you around as a business.
Yeah, and I mean, many organisations are currently facing issues from, various stakeholders asking, so what are you doing about your carbon footprint? And a lot of businesses don't actually know how much energy they're using and do need to report back to certain stakeholders on this. And that does depend on, where you're at in the supply chain, whether that's upstream or downstream. So could you just kind of expand on, I know there's a section within context of the organisation about understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. Could you just explain about that in context with energy management, Paul?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, exactly that. I mean, there's a requirement in 50001 to identify those needs and expectations of those interested parties. So they could be at a very simple level, shareholders. Equally, they could be regulators that you need to report to, and there may be legal requirements around that. And downstream as well, it could be suppliers feeding into this, clients, customers, the public, a whole rake of different interested parties who could be having an impact on you and asking questions of you as an organisation. So the ability to report on energy is getting now more and more embedded into legal requirements.
Yeah, a good example of that is the SECR here in the UK or ESOS in Europe, isn't it? The Energy Saving Opportunity Scheme.
Absolutely, yeah. So the requirement there is obviously reporting on your carbon, but in order to report on your carbon, you need to understand your energy use and the energy uses that are generating those carbon emissions within the organisation.
Yeah, so it's a starting point really, isn't it, in order to be able to communicate with these stakeholders on their needs and expectations.
Absolutely, yeah. So capturing all of that, in the mix. Interestingly, 50001 also includes within this, in clause 4, the requirements to consider those legal requirements and those other requirements as well.
Could you give us an example of some other requirements then, Paul? So we mentioned about legal requirements. What's an example of an other requirement that a company might need to adhere to?
So one of those other requirements in very simple form is the standard itself, ISO 50001. If that's a standard that the organisation voluntarily complies with or does that from a legal perspective. So 50001 is a good example. It could be a group requirement. So if you're form part of a larger group, there could be group requirements that are being placed on you as an organisation could be very simply to maintain certification, or they could be contractual requirements, placed on you by your customers.
Yeah, or I guess if you're leasing a building, it could be the landlord's requirements as well, could it, in relation to energy?
Potentially, yes, if there's clauses in lease or landlord obligations to maintain equipment, reduce energy use, or even just very simply to maintain plant and equipment or assets at certain temperatures, for example, or as part of just planned or reactive maintenance considerations.
So we touched on legal requirements very briefly. I think what we'll do is we'll pick up on that when we're looking at, why implement 50,001 and not 14,001, because I know there's a heap of legislation around energy management right now. So we won't get into the nitty gritty of that. But I mean, I think, one of the things that an organisation needs to try and understand is looking at the scope of the energy management system as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. As with any other standard, there's a requirement to define the scope and boundaries of the management system. A couple of specific areas that are unique to 50001 here. It's really important that if you're thinking about implementing ISO 50001, that actually you have the ability to, an authority, more importantly, to control energy efficiency, energy use, and energy consumption within the scope and boundaries of the management system. And just to try and elaborate on that slightly, if you have control of your buildings, your plant, your equipment, the energy that's coming into those buildings, you're basically paying for that energy, then it could well be that an energy management system is for you. But if you're sitting in a landlord controlled building where you can't even touch the thermostat, and all of the lighting's switching on automatically, and you can't even change a light bulb or do anything, within your area of authority, then the scope for you to be able to actually make those improvements is going to be very limited. The other thing specific to 50,001 here as well is that, if you are going down the 50,001 route and you take this step, you can't be selective around the energy types which you consider within your scope and boundaries. So, for example, there, if you're sitting in industrial facilities that consumes electricity, diesel, and gas, you couldn't exclude diesel, for example. You have to consider that in the mix within the scope and physical boundaries of your activities. So you can't be selective. It's all or nothing when you're thinking about defining those scope and boundaries. So that's really important. And sometimes, particularly when we're talking about boundaries, we can be talking about individual buildings within those boundaries. So you can get down to some very specific definitions there.
Okay, there's some great advice there, Paul, around scope and boundaries. And I think that's probably why I think with this being such a comprehensive standard for businesses, that it gives it that added credibility and confidence, doesn't it, to stakeholders, that you're not just restricting the scope or, being selective about your energy consumption and including that in the energy management system, but you're including all aspects of it. There's no hiding, which is good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the credibility is the key word there. I think it provides that credibility and ensures that the whole organisation is captured within it.
Yeah, for sure. So you mentioned about the scope and boundaries of the energy management system, but for those listeners that don't know what an energy management system is, could you enlighten us, Paul? How would you describe what an energy management system is, and what does a company need to do with that?
So an energy management system basically is a framework. It's a set of requirements that you're implementing as an organisation. Obviously, the requirements are laid out within 50,001, and it's a framework for continual improvement. And when we're talking about energy, we're talking about continual improvement in energy performance, energy use, energy efficiency, and energy consumption. And they all have specific definitions within the standard. So this is where I think in the previous podcast I touched on the definitions part and the importance of just having a scan through that as you're implementing 50,001 to understand those definitions, and also understand that continual improvement can be demonstrated through one or some or all of those considerations. And this is a question I regularly get asked by organisations that are growing, and they're talking about, we've got big expansion plans and we want to expand our facilities and we want to produce more and get more output, etc. And by virtue of that, they're going to naturally use more energy. So energy consumption is going to go up. But when you factor in things like energy efficiency, and you're able to think about kilowatts per metre squared, or kilowatts per product produced, or kilowatts per 100,000 pounds of turnover, then you've got a measure of efficiency there, and hopefully, the expectation would be that you can demonstrate continual improvement in efficiency. It's an interesting area to dive into, but it's important to stress that having an energy management system doesn't mean necessarily that by virtue of that you're not going to use more energy, or you're going to be restricted in growth or whatever it might be. So yeah, it can be demonstrated in other ways. That's the key message there.
Okay, great. Thanks for that explanation, Paul. And I think that's a really important point. Businesses who are looking at implementing an energy management system, they shouldn't think, oh, well, we're going to fail because we're expanding and we're going to be using more energy. Like you say, it's about the efficiency of using that energy, isn't it, as an organisation? So talking about the next step then, which is clause 5, leadership. On a number of podcast interviews, when I've interviewed businesses that have implemented ISO standards, many of them have stressed the importance of leadership commitment and how it's made such a difference to the success of their project. I guess from an energy management point of view, this isn't any different. So could you just expand on the requirements on leadership within the standard, Paul?
Sure, yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, in any organisation, you need that top level commitment and leadership and drive, if nothing else, to provide the resources to maintain the energy management system. And there's a number of requirements within 50,001 that are specific to to leadership. And clause 5.1 really picks up on that and defines what those commitments are. Certainly, top management should support the definition, and ensuring that the scope and boundaries are established and are correct for the organisation. They should be endorsing things like the energy policy, getting involved in setting objectives and targets, and also making sure that they are aligned with the strategic direction of the business. So, if you've got business plans to expand and grow, energy management should form part of those discussions and should form part of the business plan. And that really ties into the next area, which ensures that the energy management system sits within the organisation's business processes and doesn't kind of run alongside business as usual. It actually forms part of business as usual. So there's a real focus there on top management to support getting the management system embedded in the business. Beyond that, again, top management have a key role in promoting positive messages around the energy management system, making sure that the management system achieves its intended outcomes in terms of achieving those energy savings and efficiency improvements, promoting continual improvement, all again positive messages that management should be putting out there. Specific point within 50,001 talks about the formation of an energy management team, and again top management take on that responsibility for ensuring that energy management team is established. Now, key message there is don't panic if you're a very small organisation, and ultimately you might be that one person has overall management responsibility for energy management within your organisation. Going back again to those terms and definitions that are contained within the standard, it does allow for the fact that an energy management team can be formed of one person. So that dismisses the idea that there's no I in team. So an energy management team can be one person or a number of persons pulled together. Again, the organisation defines it, but top management need to support that. Additionally to that, again, within 50,001, top management should ensure that the energy performance indicators that are established are accurate and actually represent the energy performance in the business and are realistic, and will actually provide sensible indicators, which again is critical for defining those energy efficiency considerations. And that the processes are established as well and implemented if there are changes affecting the energy management system and the energy performance within the scope and boundaries of the ENMS. So making sure that basically any changes are weaved in.
So as part of Clause 4 under leadership, top management need to establish an energy policy. Now, many organisations have got an environmental policy statement. Paul, could you just explain, what should be included within an energy policy in relation to Clause 5?
Yeah, so in regards to policy, broadly similar requirements to what you'd see in an ISO 14001 policy for environmental management. But again, there are some specifics within energy management which will make sense as we get more into the implementation. So at a very broad level, the policy needs to be appropriate to the organisation. It needs to provide that framework for setting objectives and targets. We touched on the fact that an energy management system is a very data-driven, information-driven standard, and C in 5.2 includes a commitment to ensure the availability of that information and necessary resources to achieve those objectives and energy targets. So hopefully that kind of makes sense as to why that specific requirement is in there. We've already touched on legal requirements, and there's a requirement in the policy to ensure that a commitment to satisfy those legal requirements. So there's no point in having legal requirements if you're not going to abide to them and comply with them. As in all other standards, there's a requirement to continual improvement of energy performance, and as we touched on earlier, energy performance can include consumption, use and efficiency. And in the back end of the policy, it talks about supporting procurement of energy efficient products and services that impact energy performance, and also supporting design activities that consider energy performance improvement as well. And again, as we get further into the standard, it will become apparent as to why those sub-clause requirements are contained within the policy, and that it's really important that top management actually buy into that and endorse that at the policy level and at the strategic level, because it does appear in the operational section later on.
Great. I'd just like to pick up on one of those aspects that you mentioned in the energy policy, which is about energy procurement. So the policy needs to support procurement of energy efficient products and services. So would you say that this would be complementary to, Scope 3 emissions? So looking at how you procure your energy products and services?
Yeah, certainly looking at Scope 3 carbon emissions will inform that and give you a sense of where those products and services are coming from and where the emissions are arising from them. But equally, if you drill down into those emissions, then where those energy sources are. It also supports the procurement of energy as well. So if you're actually going out and purchasing energy, going out to the market and buying electricity, gas, whatever it might be, if you're able to move away from the traditional carbon intense energy sources and move towards renewables, again that's seen very much as a positive and something you can certainly go after as part of a 50001 implementation. Beyond that though, if you're looking at purchasing products, and products could be infrastructure, it could be products that actually go into your product stream. Again, considering the energy that's used in the production of those products. So that is where certainly the design clause and the procurement clause very much work in tandem with each other, where design obviously leads into then procurement and ultimately use.
Yeah, actually, there is a podcast episode that we recorded a while ago, which is episode 77, which is all about supply chain influence. And we actually covered a standard. It was ISO 20400 on sustainable procurement. So it's a guidance document. It's not a certifiable standard, but that's something that our ISO show listeners might be interested in if they're looking at greening their supply chain. So does that pretty much cover clause 5 then, Paul, or is there anything else that we need to cover before we move on to 6?
Very nearly covers clause 5. The only additional clause there is around organisational roles, responsibilities and authorities, and again with exactly the same as other standards. The energy management system standard is exactly the same. Things to consider there, we touched on the energy management team, so it would be good to define the roles, responsibilities, level of authority that team has. There are some specific responsibilities as well for making sure that the management system is established, implemented, maintained, continually improved, making sure that the management system conforms to the requirements of 50001, implementing action plans, reporting as well on performance, and also to making sure that the operational control aspects of the ENMS are implemented and effectively maintained. So all of those responsibilities ultimately need to be defined and distributed throughout the organisation.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Paul. So moving on to clause 6 then, planning. I mean, this is where we really get under the skin, isn't it, of an organisation to really understand how they're using energy and what the inputs are, and to plan for the managing activities and planning the outputs as well. So do you mind just breaking this down for us, Paul?
Yeah, certainly. This clause for me really is one of the central pillars of 50001, and if you do this clause well as an organisation, your management system will absolutely fly. Things that people who are familiar with management systems will notice in this particular clause, it goes up to 6.6, which is pretty much unique, I think, in any other management system. And it's an area where, certainly if you're looking to align 50001 to other management systems, you need to sort of take a step back and approach this in a slightly different manner. But fundamentally, it breaks down into two areas. What they call the strategic planning, and another area they call tactical planning. What I mean by that, when we talk about strategic planning, is what we're trying to do there is take those internal issues that we identified, those needs of your interested parties, any high-level risks and opportunities that have been defined, and think about then actions to address those risks and opportunities. So very broadly similar to other ISO standards up to this point. So that's where we're taking those high-level issues that are keeping the board awake at night and actually planning actions to address them. And equally, that's where, again, if you're implementing management systems for the first time, that's where you can get a lot of buy-in, because then the top management can see that there's actions being taken to hopefully make their lives easier. So at the tactical level, this is where we get into energy review and tactical planning considerations. And this is absolutely critical for organisations to get a handle on. This is where typically when I'm implementing management systems, I spend the most time with our clients getting this absolutely right. And very often it can take 2 or 3 bites to get it to where it needs to be. And the first thing to say, it's a process. So there's planning inputs, there's the planning activities, and there's planning outputs. On the input side, we need to understand our current energy types. So that might be, say for example, electricity, gas, diesel, coal, petrol, you name it. So whole different types of energy that any organisation will be consuming. So that forms an input into the energy planning process at a tactical level. We also need to understand what our past and current energy uses are, just to understand whether we're using more energy than we used to, different types of energy mix coming in, just getting an understanding of where we are today to be able to then start to think about then what actions we could take going forward. Linked to that as well, past and current energy consumption as well. So getting the numbers, building up the numbers. And again, this is an area where this can take some time because you're going back in time. You need as an organisation to select what is an appropriate length of time to go back and just understand exactly what the numbers are. Really importantly to understand as well, whether those numbers are accurate, because you might be going back to old historical meter readings, old billing information. There could be estimates within that. So all of that needs to be factored in when you're thinking about those planning inputs. Once that's understood and fed in and you've got that data, then you can actually undertake an energy review. The whole objective of the energy review is to determine what your significant energy uses are, or the SEUs as the standard calls it. It's also important to understand where the variables are in all of that. So when I'm talking about variables, it could be, for example, that the weather, changes in external temperature could be a variable that could affect how much energy you're using as an organisation. It could be that the production demand fluctuates between seasons or particular periods of the year. So that can be a variable as well. So identify those variables and factor those in, and that might have in fact almost certainly will have an impact on your energy performance indicators when you're thinking about those. We also need to define the personnel involved and those personnel within the organisation who can actually affect energy use. So those people who can turn the thermostat up and down, or increase production, or change the temperature, or whatever it might be. All of those personnel need to be understood and considered when we're defining our energy review. And also, really importantly, and again this is where a really effective energy management team can come into its own, we need to determine and prioritise opportunities for improvement. So that's where as an organisation you can go out into the workforce and start to engage them and start to say to them, okay, well, guys and girls, where can we improve? Where are the opportunities? Feed us your improvement suggestions to help us then consider whether they can be implemented, and that will ultimately then feed into the objectives and targets. So coming out of the other side of the actual energy review process itself, on the output side, what we're looking to try and identify is the energy use and consumption trends within the organisation, an estimate of future energy use and consumption, appreciating that there's a certain degree of a crystal ball gazing required there in order to determine what your future energy use is likely to be. And again, factors that might influence that may include planned expansion plans, current production levels, a whole rake of different things that will influence your future energy use and consumption projections. We also need to define those opportunities for energy improvement and which ones we're going to take forward, again from that input we had from the energy management team. We need to have our defined significant energy uses, and it's really important to stress that again the organisation defines what significant looks like, and that's something to consider for inclusion in your process and procedure for energy review. What does significant look like?
Paul, you touched on significant energy use, as the standard refers to it as an SEU. Could you just provide an example of what an SEU could look like for an organisation? Let's say an NHS trust, a hospital.
Yeah, so if we took an example of a hospital, typical SEUs in a hospital would be, say for example, gas used in the generation of heating for both space heating and hot water. So that would be a typical definition of an SEU in a hospital trust or an NHS trust.
So the energy review would then help you to identify that SEU and to provide the data around the SEU about the use of gas?
Yes, and more specifically where it's used as well. So it's going to be gas use, for example, in the boilers. So that might give you a good steer as to where to focus your energy improvement actions on. So it might be you then look at a boiler replacement program or maintenance program to make sure that those boilers are working efficiently or possibly even replace them with less carbon intensive options, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thanks for that, Paul. It just helps to be able to kind of visualize, some of the terminology that you're using in relation to the standard, and some practical examples in real life, which helps you to be able to put it into context really with the standard. So thanks for that.
The standard uses a lot of abbreviations, and SEUs is one of those central abbreviations that's used. Beyond that as well, the standard talks about energy performance indicators, or EMPIs. So that's where typically we're trying to define energy performance indicators around consumption, efficiency, use as well. So again, typical example from a consumption perspective would be kilowatts, kilowatt hours. From an efficiency perspective, you might be looking at kilowatt hours per meter square or per meter of product produced, or whatever it might be. The other key one is energy baselines, or EMBs as they're known within the standard. And it's really important again to define a sensible energy baseline by which you're going to measure against. Absolutely critical to get that right again. So energy performance indicators, energy baselines will form the central part of your monitoring and measuring activities, and being able to monitor against a sensible energy baseline. So pick a year where you know the data is accurate. Don't, for example, go back and set your energy baseline as 2020 when everybody was in the middle of a pandemic and nothing was happening and everybody was working from home, because you'll suddenly be wondering why it is that, as business returns to usual, why you're not actually improving against that baseline. So the important thing there is set a sensible baseline. Pick a typical year or period in time that you can measure against, and all your continual improvement then is measured against that baseline, which we'll touch on as we get into clause 9. Final couple of parts of the planning outputs are the requirement to define those energy objectives, targets and action plans. So all of the data that you've accrued from your strategic and tactical planning activities will inform the setting of those objectives and targets. And finally, you can establish an energy data collection plan, which again is unique to 50001, but forms a really critical pillar which helps you to define the meters, where those meters are, how often you're going to be reading those meters, who's responsible for reading those meters. And that helps again to inform the monitor and measuring piece, which we'll touch on, as I say, when we get into clause 9.
Okay, yeah, I can see now why that data collection on energy, it goes into so much more detail than just the ESOS reporting, the energy saving opportunity schemes, which for some organisations it's a bit of a tick box exercise. I mean, we know it's a legal requirement, but we can see now why the regulators in the UK have basically said, well, if you have ISO 50001, we're happy that you meet the requirements of ESOS, and it's clear to see now how this goes above and beyond in terms of the identification of energy consumption, but it goes into so much more detail than that, doesn't it, in terms of identifying opportunities for improvement, etc.
Absolutely, yeah. And it picks up on that concept that this is actually a framework for managing continual improvement in energy use, as opposed to just doing an energy audit. And from an ESOS perspective, there's no obligation to actually implement those recommendations from an energy audit. With 50,001, you have to demonstrate that continual improvement, again in use, efficiency, or consumption.
Yeah, so you can see now where the credibility comes in, can't you? By being able to put into practice, not just as a one-off exercise, but on an ongoing basis. So that said, that kind of leads us on to clause 7, which is support, and obviously you need people and resources to be able to make all of this happen. So could you just walk us through clause 7 now, Paul?
Yeah, certainly. Clause 7 itself is broadly similar to other standards, actually. So if you've got a quality management standard or environmental management system standard in place, you'll probably recognise most of the content within clause 7. The first part of the clause talks about resources and ensuring that the organisation determines and provides, more importantly, the resources needed for the ongoing implementation, management, continuing improvement of energy performance. Clause 7.2 talks about competence in defining the necessary competency requirements for people doing work under its control or under the organisation's control that can affect energy performance and the ENMS. That can include contractors if you're outsourcing maintenance work, that sort of thing. Making sure that those people are competent on the basis of appropriate education, training, skills, experience as appropriate. Somewhere where 50,001 has a specific requirement here, it talks about where those competency requirements aren't met, you need to take action to acquire the necessary competence and evaluate the effectiveness of the actions taken. So that's a little bit above and beyond other standards, but that's quite a subtle but important consideration there. Making sure that actually you can train somebody, but they might not necessarily come out of that training competent. They could have been looking out the window or or whatever it might have been as they were being trained. So the evaluation of the effectiveness of those actions is really important, just to make sure that people actually are competent and that they haven't just got a piece of paper to say that they attended the course. Supporting that, retaining records, documented information of evidence of competency, again, is common to other standards. So we need to be able to demonstrate that competency. That leads us into awareness and ensuring that again, those persons working under the organisation's control, so that could be employees and possibly contractors, visitors, anybody coming into the organisation, they need to be aware of the energy policy, they need to be aware of how they contribute to the effectiveness of the management system, how they contribute to achieving objectives, targets, giving them awareness of the benefits of improved energy performance. Some of the things we were talking about earlier in regards to carbon emissions, lower overheads, costs, benefit, etc. Also making them aware of their impact, their activities, how they have a part to play in all of this, and ultimately the implications of not conforming with the management system requirements. That's supported by communication clause, again very similar to other standards. So we need to both communicate internally and externally, or consider that at least. And we need to think about what we're going to talk about, when we're going to communicate, who we're going to communicate with, the method, and ultimately who is responsible for communicating that information out.
And we are going to be talking about communication in a bit more detail when we talk about launching your energy management system in one of the podcasts, when it comes on to how to implement the ISO standard, because obviously that's critical, isn't it? There isn't much point in having an energy management system if nobody knows anything about it. And also, just touching on the points you raised there about training and competency, we have got some training modules within the ISOlogy Hub. So if any members of the ISOlogy Hub are interested, there's content in there, and there's going to be some more content going in there as well at the end of 2021 and also early part of 2022 as we add more content to the ISOlogy Hub. And just finally, just on the communication, just a reminder for our ISO show listeners, we've got a free download, which is the ISO Standards Blueprint on how to plan, create, launch and achieve certification to ISO standards. And some of the areas that Paul's touching on now as far as communications, there is a communications plan in there to help you to do that. So sorry to interrupt there, Paul, but I thought it was good good little plug for the ISOlogy Hub there. So so anything else that we need to cover on the support clause before we move on to 8?
Well, just a final point on support, and that's in relation to documented information. And again, this clause very broadly follows other ISO standards. If you've got document management processes in place, you should be fine with this. The fundamental point being that we have to include documented information required by the standard. So anywhere where you see the words documented information appear in 50001, you can do a little search on that. That will highlight the areas where you need to have documentation in place, but also documented information required by the organisation to demonstrate your own processes are effective. That needs to also be maintained. And typical to other standards.
Oh, sorry to interrupt there, Paul, but again, could you just provide an example of the type of documented information that an organisation would need then? So let's say they've already got ISO 14001 in place or ISO 9001 in place. What additional type of documented information would the standard require you to have? And I'm not expecting you to list all of them, but just one or two examples would be great.
So from the perspective of the standard, it would require you to define and document your scope and boundaries. It will require you to have a documented procedure for how to undertake an energy review, for example. Documented energy policy is a requirement. It has to be documented and communicated. And you have to have documented objectives and targets as well. So that cuts across basically the clauses we've talked about today from 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, for providing some examples. Again, it was just kind of put into context the standard for our listeners, that was all.
And from the organisational perspective, it may be that you maintain documented information around maintenance, for example, or procurement activities, design, specifications, etc. So there's a whole rake of documented information, both either hard copy or electronically, that the organisation will maintain in one form or another. Just finishing off on clause 7, creating and updating documentation. So again, that needs to be managed effectively, and typically most organisations will have a process for that. Increasingly now that's hosted sort of an online document management system, and ultimately the documentation needs to be controlled, so it's suitable for use, it's required, it's available where and when it's needed, and ultimately it's adequately protected as well, particularly in production situations where documentation might be stored on the shop floor, but it needs to be suitably protected to ensure that it is there when it's needed.
Okay, cool. So we move on to the juicy part of the standard, which is all about operational control. So it's about making it actually happen, isn't it, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. So operation clause 8 breaks down into 3 subclauses. The first one is around operational planning and control, which is absolutely critically important from an energy management perspective. Second one is around design and making sure that we're designing for energy efficiency and energy improvement. And the third part talks about procurement. So again, it's touching on those subject areas that earlier we mentioned when we were establishing policy. So starting with operational planning and control, we need to basically establish the operational controls required to ensure that processes are working effectively and are using energy in the most efficient and suitable form of use. Ultimately, what we're trying to avoid is what we touched on earlier, which is a significant deviation from your intended energy performance. So those procedures, controls can take a number of different forms. What I would suggest when you're thinking about those procedures is to think about areas of potential interest. So when you're looking at your activities, products, facilities, services, whatever it might be, you can be thinking about the building and the building fabric. How do we need to maintain that? You can be talking about, as we touched on earlier, combustion equipment, say for example in a hospital situation, how we maintain our boilers and other gas-fired equipment. It could relate to heating and ventilation systems, how they're maintained, air conditioning systems, what temperatures they need to be established at, and how often they need to be maintained and repaired if necessary. Almost certainly there will be operational controls around production machinery and making sure that machinery isn't necessarily, say for example, sitting idle when everyone goes for a tea break, but ultimately is still consuming energy. You could be looking at lighting and lighting control systems, and again, when to switch on, when to switch off, what are the policies and processes around all of that. Hot water also comes into consideration. Again, setting hot water temperatures, for example, could be critical. Most, if not all, organisations generate compressed air, certainly production type organisations, and a massive amount of energy can be wasted in maintaining compressed air systems, particularly if you've got leaks. That can be a real area of focus for most organisations, and some very quick wins if you just maintain your airlines and listen out for that hissing noise when everything goes quiet at the end of the shift. Similarly, supporting that as well, things like simple tasks such as pipe lagging, how often we inspect the pipes, making sure the pipes are lagged so we're not losing heat energy through the pipes into atmosphere, and that we're not having to, again, drive our equipment harder in maintaining that temperature within those pipes. It can also extend to other motor-driven equipment, so that can extend to production machinery, but also pumps, for example, for pumping water around within organisations. And again, some organisations will have on-site catering, and restaurants or whatever it might be. So again, catering areas and food production areas, they can consume a massive amount of energy, both in obviously gas, electricity, in heating food and maintaining the temperature of food. So catering areas, if you have them within your facilities, again, that can be a real area of focus and somewhere where you might want to consider developing operational controls. Moving into the design clause, so if you're thinking about developing new or modified or renovating your facilities, again, design comes into that. So you need to be thinking about design in equipment, systems, energy using processes, all of those considerations which can have a significant impact on energy performance. So trying to design in energy efficiency right from the outset, again, will drive improvement, and it's fair game to claim that in an audit situation. But equally, that also informs the development of design specifications, which in turn then feed into procurement activities. When we're talking about procurement activities, we're talking about procurement of energy consuming assets, but we're also talking about the purchase of energy that we touched on earlier. So if we're able to move to more renewable sources of energy, again, that's fair game to claim that in an audit situation. Very often organisations will have established procedures for design and procurement where these take place, so it's very often a case of just weaving these requirements into those business as usual type activities, which in turn again supports the commitment that we talked about right at the outset in clause 5.1 from a top management commitment, in terms of weaving the energy management system into business as normal, business as usual type activities.
I mean, talking about business as normal type activities, it would make perfect sense then to integrate these operational controls into an existing management system structure, wouldn't it? So for those businesses that don't necessarily want to go down the route of achieving certification to 50001, you could still cherry pick aspects of this standard, especially if energy is one of your most significant environmental aspects and therefore impact on the environment. So there isn't anything to stop you from doing that. I guess if you are looking at bringing in some how-to guides as well. So I don't know, you might have a CHP plant. So it's how do you use that? Okay, because obviously you need humans to be able to operate certain systems and monitor and measure the results as well. But it could be something as simple as a switch off campaign. So switching off PCs, lights, when you walk out of the room if you haven't got lighting on sensors. There are lots of hints and tips, I think, that we can get from this standard that would be complementary to any business that are looking to be more efficient with their resources, to reduce their costs, and obviously to be kinder to the planet.
Yeah, no, for sure. And a lot of this is for fear of sort of straying too far from the standard, but a lot of it is common sense. I've walked around organisations where, the gas boiler's blowing away in the corner of the room, and the doors are wide open, and just a simple control to basically switch off the gas blower when the door opens, or vice versa, can have a massive effect on energy consumption. Fixing that hole in the roof that has been dripping water in for forever and ever, looking at building fabric, looking at just simple controls, around sort of, insulating the ceilings or the voids. Again, low cost, high impact improvements which can ultimately generate savings in the kilowatts, and ultimately then knocks onto the cost savings as well.
Yeah, and I think if you don't kind of recognise these things, and as you say, a lot of it is common sense, Paul, but if you don't recognise those, if you don't capture, what people should be doing within your organisation to be able to manage these issues, you're not then in a position to be able to monitor and measure the results so that you can see when you are making improvements and making a difference, which kind of brings us on to Clause 9, which is all about performance evaluation. And I think from hearing about the impact of ESOS and the fact that, yes, it's been good because businesses have been able to pull together their energy data and to be able to report on that to the government and to identify some energy saving opportunities. But I think the downside to that is that how do you know when you're making a difference? How do you know when you're actually improving your resource efficiency? How do you know when you're reducing your costs and your impact on the environment? So could you just talk us through how an organisation can use Clause 9 to evaluate their performance?
Yeah, sure. I mean, all of those things, as you say, are achieved through monitoring and measuring. So performance evaluation, and particularly Clause 9.1 in 50,001 is absolutely critical for organisations, again, to get this right. And very often, again, I sort of get parachuted into half-finished energy management systems where organisations will very often actually get this wrong at the first attempt and need to take a step back and go again because they've misinterpreted the requirements within here. So breaking the clause down, we need to define what needs to be monitored and measured. And as a minimum, this needs to include the effectiveness of the action plans in achieving objectives and energy targets. So these are the action plans that we defined in clause 6.2. We need to measure our energy performance indicators. So that again brings us back to the importance of getting those energy performance indicators correct when we were doing our energy review back in clause 6.3, and this is where the two areas of the standard really complement each other. One leads into the other. So if you recall, we talked about energy performance indicators being established around consumption, efficiency and use. So certainly as a minimum we need to be talking about, for example, when we're talking about consumption EMPIs, it's about kilowatt hours. When we're talking about efficiency EMPIs, we're talking about kilowatt hours per whatever it might be, meter squared or product of unit shipped or number of pounds turnover, whatever it might be. So we need to get a measure of efficiency there. We also need to understand the operation of those significant energy uses. So again, we defined those in 6.3 and we identified what our significant energy uses are. So we need to be again monitoring and measuring them to determine whether we're improving those. And we also need to be looking at actual versus expected energy consumption. So this brings us back to having that forecast back in our energy review and then being able to measure against that forecast energy use. Beyond that, we need to be also thinking about what we're measuring against. So this brings us into thinking about our energy baselines that we defined back in, it was actually contained in clause 6.5. So all of our improvements against energy performance need to be evaluated by comparing our energy performance indicator values against those energy baselines. So year on year we can measure against the baseline. And very often I see organisations doing very effective monitoring and measuring, but they're just comparing against previous year's activities. What we need to do there is define that baseline and stick to it and measure year on year against that baseline. So a typical example, if you set your baseline at say 2018, your 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022 activities will always be measured against that 2018 baseline. And that will determine whether you're improving or not against that baseline. And that's where very often I'll see organisations get that particular part of the standard wrong or poorly interpret it. We also within monitoring and measuring need to think about are significant deviations. And as we touched on earlier, it's up to the organisation to define what significant deviation looks like and what it is. But we need to monitor and measure that to see whether we are ultimately achieving what we plan to achieve, or whether we've actually deviated from it. So where we do have a deviation from expected use, or an unexpected spike in energy consumption, whatever it might be, we need to then investigate those issues and retain documented information on the results of those investigations. And that's an interesting one, because it's typically, you'd think that would be an area to talk about in clause 10, where we're talking about non-conformity and corrective action, but it's actually identified in clause 9 because it's an essential part of monitoring and measuring. So we need to keep an eye on the numbers and the data to ensure that if we do start to see variation or spikes or unexpected activity there, that we can react accordingly and not wait until next month when the data comes out to discover that we've actually had a serious incident, or a significant deviation from our expected energy use. Another thing to throw in the mix here as well is in regards to how we capture that data, how we record it, present it. Very often that's done on online systems rather than Excel spreadsheets these days, and more often than not organisations will have a building management system or something of that ilk to monitor and record energy use. Linked to that, we also need to consider calibration as well. So asking the question, do we need to calibrate our equipment? Is it calibrated for life? Can we in some way ensure that equipment is giving us consistent and repeatable data? So all of those things we need to factor in when we're thinking about monitoring and measuring.
Thanks, Paul. I think that the other two areas are around internal audits and management review, aren't they? In monitoring and measurement, but that's similar to other standards for those listeners that have already got those in place, so they'll be familiar with that. But actually, I know that you do drill down into great detail when it comes to energy audits, which you've done across Europe, haven't you? And over many years' experience. And actually, I think what we might do is leave that for another podcast, Paul, because I know that there are a ton of tips and guidance and information that you can provide to our ISO show listeners on how to audit against ISO 50001. So I think we'll leave that one to another podcast. But before we move on to 10, the final one for continuing improvement, could you just kind of share with us a little bit on management review? For those listeners that are familiar with management review but might not know about what type of things you might want to cover that are a bit different when it comes to 50001.
Sure. So management review ultimately is an opportunity to take a step back and reflect on where we've been over the last 12 months or period in time. It's up to you to define basically what that period looks like. Typically that's annually, but it can be done monthly or 6 monthly, or you could tap into existing meeting structures, whatever it might be. Fundamentally, what we're trying to do is to make sure that the management system remains suitable, adequate and effective, and is driving that continuing improvement. A management review breaks down into, it's a process basically, inputs, the process and outputs. On the input side, we need to be thinking about actions from previous management reviews, any changes in risks or strategic context that could affect the energy management system. And we're also presenting information on non-conformities, corrective actions, monitoring and measuring results, the results of audits, the results of evaluations of compliance with those legal and other requirements that we touched upon earlier. We're also cutting across any opportunities for continuing improvement that have been brought forward, and they can be weaved into future objectives. That extends to continuing improvement around competency as well. So again, that touches on that point I made earlier in clause 7.2 about ensuring that those people are competent as a result of any training. It gives us an opportunity to look at our energy policy and review the energy policy as well, and again ensure that remains suitable for use. We also fundamentally want to look at, are we achieving our objectives and targets? We need to look at our energy performance and energy performance improvements based on that monitoring and measuring of our energy performance indicators against our baselines, and the status of any action plans that we're in the process of implementing. So the management review can be a process, it can be a meeting, it can be a report, it can be done in a number of different mechanisms really. Again, you decide as the organisation what is the most appropriate mechanism for conducting management review. Ultimately though, in terms of documented information, the outputs for management review need to be recorded and retained. And those outputs need to include any decisions, opportunities relating to improved energy performance, the energy policy, any changes to performance indicators or baselines, any actions to achieve objectives where they've not been achieved, any opportunities to improve, again, that integration with business as usual type activities, any additional resources that might be required, and any actions in regards to improving competence awareness and communication within the business.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, Paul. And I think, leading on then to the next and final clause 10, continuing improvement. So you've mentioned about, how a good management review picks up on all the opportunities for improvement. So I guess the continual improvement clause is about putting that into action and being able to demonstrate how you are continually improving. So just to wrap up the episode today, could you just give us a brief summary on continual improvement?
Sure, yeah. On the improvement clause in clause 10, it again broadly follows other standards. So the first part of this talks about non-conformity and corrective action. And as with other standards, there is a requirement there, particularly with energy management standards, to, in the first instance, react to non-conformities as they occur. So that could be, we talked about earlier, a deviation from expected use. So if suddenly you see a big spike in energy use, we need to react to that and make a correction immediately to make sure it doesn't get any worse. Beyond that, then we get into reviewing the non-conformity, understanding why it happened, determine the root cause of that non-conformity, and then implement appropriate longer-term corrective actions to make sure that doesn't happen again. All of that, as per other standards, needs to be recorded, captured, and followed through on, and we touched on just a minute ago, reviewed during management review. Typically, things can go wrong for a number of different reasons. When I'm working with energy management systems, things generally go wrong because the management system hasn't been aligned with organisational objectives. Very often there can be a lack of financial resources made available. So organisations or energy management teams want to actually improve something or make a change, but actually the finances aren't there to actually support that. And again, that's where we get a misalignment with the strategic and the operational considerations. Very often things can go wrong when a management system is built and maintained by one person, and you get one person basically managing the whole piece. You've got a single point of failure there, effectively, potentially. The other best advice I can give as well, in order to prevent things going wrong, is take your time with it. Implement the management system over a period of time. So typically I see problems when management systems are rushed and implemented in a very short space of time and aren't actually properly embedded in organisations. Sometimes you get confusion as well in regards to responding to energy deviations or non-conformities. Again, that can cause issues, particularly if you don't address them at the point of failure. Other instances as well, you get top management lack of commitment, or they talk about it but don't actually back it up with the support and the finances, and they don't actually practice what they preach. As Greta said, it's the blah blah blah, but sometimes that can be a problem. They think it's a nice thing to do, and they like the idea of having an energy management system, but don't actually realise that actually it's going to also include commitment from them, resources, information, and all the things we talked about in 5.1 when we talked about management commitment. So some of those are typical sort of examples of where things can go wrong. I mean, I don't want to go into massive detail on that, but again, from my experience of implementing energy management systems, that's where I've seen, certainly in some organisations, where that can be a little bit of a challenge for some.
Yeah, well, we're going to be talking all about how to implement ISO 50001 in another podcast, so we'll leave that until then. But thanks very much for wrapping up on continual improvement clause on clause 10. So Yeah, Paul, you've provided a really fantastic, comprehensive overview of each clause from 4 to 10. So I really appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy diary to share that wealth of information with all of our ISO show listeners. Yeah, thanks very much for joining us today, Paul.
Pleasure.
Great. So if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast and you've taken away some hints and tips, and you might have even had some of those aha moments when you've been, looking at this standard and scratching your head, and it's all kind of making sense to you now, please do leave us a review on whichever podcast player you listen to these podcasts on. So if it's iTunes, you can leave a review. The reason for that is it really does help us to share this best practice, to share this knowledge to a much wider audience. And I'm really grateful for everybody that's left a review. I mean, we have listeners in 35 countries now across the globe, which is absolutely awesome. So yeah, we want to continue sharing all the best practice and the love for ISO standards to that audience. So it really does make a massive difference if you can leave us with a nice shiny 5-star review on the podcast. Just a quick reminder that there is that download available free of charge to help you to plan, create, launch, implement and achieve certification to ISO 50001. So it is a blueprint for implementing any ISO standard, but it is very relevant to 50001 as well. So if you've been listening to the podcast and think, yeah, that is something that we would like to explore, even if it's not, going all the way down the route of achieving certification, you just think, actually, we want to do something to improve our energy within our business, because we've heard, Paul, we can pick up on lots of things from all of those explanations that is provided around ISO 50001. We think, yeah, we'd like to adopt some of that within the business. So yeah, thanks once again, Paul. It's been a pleasure having you on the ISO show. I know it's been an extended version compared to other podcasts that we've had on, but I think all the information that you've been providing us with has been really, really useful. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I look forward to catching up with our ISO show listeners on the next episode, which will be talking about how to implement ISO 50001.
Looking to use ISO